The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from Alara's bones and the moisture from her cracked lips. It scoured the barren plains, a vast, gray expanse of dirt and brittle grass that offered no comfort, no quarter. For 3 days, the horizon had been a mercilessly straight line, broken only by the shimmering heat that warped the air. Now, a shape coalesced in the distance. Not a mirage, but the hard, dark angles of a homestead. It was a scar on the land, as lonely and weathered as she was. Hope was a fool's currency she could no longer afford, but her body, a traitorous vessel of instinct, stumbled toward it. Each step was a negotiation with collapse. Her dress, once a respectable blue, was torn and faded to the color of dust. The hunger was a hollow ache that had long ago sharpened into a constant, biting pain. She thought of her husband, Thomas, gone a year now, his absence a phantom limb she still reached for in the night. Then she thought of his brother, Jonas, his face a cruel mask of piety as he and his wife had cast her out. A barren field yields no crop, he had declared before the grim-faced elders, his words sealing her fate. They had taken the farm, the home she had built with Thomas, and left her with nothing but the whispers that followed her out of town. Useless, empty, cursed. The farmstead grew clearer, a single small cabin and a larger barn, both built of dark, unpainted timber that seemed to have absorbed the harshness of the sun and wind. No smoke rose from the chimney, no life stirred. Still, she pressed on, her vision tunneling until the splintered wood of the fence was all she could see. Her hand reached for it, a final, desperate anchor, but her strength gave out. The world tilted, the gray earth rising up to meet her in a silent, suffocating embrace. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and old dust. She lay on a coarse wool blanket spread over a cot in the corner of a room lit by the flickering dance of a hearth fire. A man sat at a simple wooden table, his back to her, broad and still. He was a silhouette against the flames, a mountain of quiet intensity. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her exhaustion. She had traded the slow death of the plains for an unknown, perhaps more immediate, danger. She remained utterly still, feigning sleep, her breath shallow. He did not move, did not turn. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside, a world away. After a time that felt like an eternity, he rose. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful beneath a worn shirt. His face, when he finally turned toward the firelight, was a map of solitude. A thick, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were shadowed, holding a depth of stillness that was more unnerving than any open hostility. He moved to the hearth, ladled water from a kettle into a tin cup, and placed it on the floor beside her cot, along with a thick slice of dark bread. He did so with a complete lack of ceremony, an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and profound isolation. He never looked directly at her. Then he returned to his chair and the silent vigil he seemed to keep with the flames. She was a stray animal he had brought in from the storm, a problem to be dealt with, not a person to be acknowledged. Lying there, listening to the silence of the man and the howling of the wind, Alara understood she was utterly at his mercy. The bread remained untouched as she slipped back into a fitful, dreamless sleep, the fear a cold stone in her belly. The days that followed fell into a silent, unvarying rhythm. Each morning, Alara would wake to find the man gone. A bowl of simple porridge and a cup of water left on the small table. He would be gone for hours, working his land with a relentless, solitary focus she could observe from the cabin's single, grimy window. He mended fences, tilled a small garden, and tended to a handful of chickens with a capability that was both admirable and intimidating. He moved as if the world contained only him and the tasks at hand. She was a ghost in his house, a presence he tolerated but refused to see. The silence was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all impulse to speak. What would she say? Thank you? Who are you? The words felt meaningless in this place where actions were the only language. Slowly, her strength returned. She began to move about the small cabin, her steps tentative at first, then more certain. The space was Spartan, scrubbed clean but devoid of any softness. There was one chair, one table, one cot, one bed. Every object had a purpose. There was no room for sentiment. It was the home of a man who had systematically purged the unnecessary from his life, and perhaps, she thought, had come to view human connection as the most unnecessary thing of all. She found a needle and thread in a small box and mended the tear in her dress, the small, repetitive motion a comfort in the vast quiet. He would return at dusk, prepare a simple meal of beans or salted meat, and they would eat at the same table, separated by a chasm of unspoken history. His gaze never lingered on her. It was fixed on his plate or the fire or some point deep within himself. She learned the landscape of his face, the permanent furrows in his brow, the hard set of his jaw, the profound, aching loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Her attention was increasingly drawn to the barn, specifically, to the single dairy cow he kept, a gentle, doe-eyed creature with a dappled brown hide. He called her Bess. Alara heard him murmur the name once, his voice a low, rusty rumble as he stroked the animal's flank. Every evening, he would sit on a low stool, rest his head against the cow's warm side, and the rhythmic pull and hiss of milking would fill the twilight air. It was a ritual of profound peace, a moment of gentle communion in a life of harsh angles. Alara found herself watching, mesmerized. The image of the man and the cow, the life-giving milk streaming into the pail, began to take root in her mind, growing into an obsession. It was an answer to a question she hadn't dared to ask. It was the antithesis of Jonas's damning words. Barren field, empty vessel. The cow was life. The milk was sustenance, nurture, a promise fulfilled. It was everything she had been told she was not, everything she had been made to feel she had failed to be. A desperate, wild idea began to form, a need so primal it overshadowed her fear of the silent man. It was a terrifying, audacious hope. One evening, as he walked from the barn toward the cabin, the empty milk pail swinging from his hand, she stepped out of the doorway and stood directly in his path. He stopped, his eyes finally, fully, landing on her. The directness of the gaze was a physical shock. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she did not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could not speak. The words were lodged in her throat, rusted from disuse and fear. Instead, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed to herself. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pointed toward the barn, toward Bess. The man's face, a stony mask of indifference for weeks, finally broke. His brows drew together in a knot of profound confusion. He stared at her, then at the barn, then back at her, as if she were speaking a language he had long forgotten and could not comprehend. The silence stretched, taut and humming with her unspoken plea. She held his gaze, pouring all of her desperation, her shame, and her sliver of hope into it. For 15 years, he had walled himself off from the world. Now, a wraith of a woman was standing on his doorstep, not asking for food or shelter, but for something far more complex. He saw the raw, aching need in her eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, the first sound he had made that was not born of physical labor. He gave a single, sharp nod. The first lesson was a study in frustration. Alara's hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, were clumsy and weak on the cow's warm flesh. She fumbled, her touch too hesitant, then too rough. Bess shifted, lowing in gentle protest. Alara flinched back, shame heating her cheeks. The man, Silas, stood watching, his arms crossed over his chest, his face impassive. He offered no words of encouragement, no gentle guidance. There was only the task and her failure to perform it. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to flee, to succumb to the familiar sting of inadequacy. But then she looked at the pail, empty on the straw-strewn floor, and the stubborn resolve that had carried her across the plains hardened within her. He must have seen the shift in her posture, the tightening of her jaw. With a quiet sigh, he stepped forward. He knelt beside her on the low stool, his presence beside her so close it felt like a brand. He did not speak. Instead, he reached out, and his large, calloused hands covered her own. The shock of his touch was startling. It was rough but steady, entirely impersonal, yet it was the most intimate contact she had known since Thomas's death. He guided her fingers, showing her the precise pressure, the gentle, rhythmic pull and release. His hands taught hers the language of the cow, a silent conversation of trust and nurture. The milk, at first a hesitant trickle, finally began to hiss into the pail in a steady, white stream. A tremor ran through Alara, a profound and seismic release of tension. It was a sound of victory, of life. Day after day, the ritual repeated. The milking became the center of her existence, a sacrament performed at dusk. The initial awkwardness gave way to a quiet competence. She learned the warmth of Bess's flank against her cheek, the sweet, grassy smell of her breath, the steady rhythm of her own hands creating sustenance. It was a meditation, a healing. With each stream of milk, she felt as if she were washing away the stain of Jonas's judgment, reclaiming a part of herself she thought had been irrevocably lost. One afternoon, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows from the barn door. Alara was alone with Bess, lost in the peaceful rhythm of her work. The pail was nearly full. A shadow fell across her, long and sharp. She looked up, expecting Silas, but the silhouette was wrong. It was leaner, hunched with a familiar, predatory energy. Jonas stood in the doorway, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. Well, well, the stray returns to a barn, just where she belongs, he said, his voice a venomous drawl that shattered the evening's peace. The town is worried for you. I've come to bring you home. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. But it was different now, not the hollow despair of before, but a sharp, defiant anger. Before she could answer, Silas emerged from the side of the barn, moving with a fluid silence that was startling. He carried a heavy wood axe, resting it lightly on his shoulder, and placed himself between Alara and her brother-in-law. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a guardian, a wall of unyielding granite. Jonas's sneer faltered. He looked from the small, seated woman to the towering, silent man. This is family business, friend. She is my brother's widow. My responsibility. Silas did not move. The silence in the barn grew thick, heavy with imminent violence. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a rasp, a sound torn from the earth, unused and powerful. No. The single word hung in the air, an absolute and unbreakable declaration. Jonas stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer finality of it. He took a half-step back. Alara, her hands still on the cow, slowly rose to her feet. She clutched the handle of the warm, heavy pail, its weight a newfound anchor. She met Jonas's furious gaze, and for the first time in his presence, she felt no fear. There was only the quiet strength of the man beside her and the undeniable proof of her own worth, sloshing gently in the bucket she held. Jonas's bluster evaporated under their combined, unwavering stare. He looked from the immovable form of Silas, axe held at a casual but ready angle, to the woman he had tried to break, now standing tall and unbroken. He saw no victim here. He saw a fortress he could not breach. With a curse that was more frustration than threat, he spat on the dusty ground, turned, and strode away, his retreating figure swallowed by the deepening twilight. He did not look back. The silence that descended upon the barn in his wake was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. It was not empty or tense, but filled with the reverberation of what had passed between them. The immediate danger was gone, but the ground had irrevocably shifted. Silas lowered the axe, resting its head on the floor, but he did not move from his position. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, for the first time, held a direct and open question. He didn't need to ask why Jonas was here or who he was. His gaze asked something deeper. Why this? Why the cow? Alara drew a shaky breath, the air tasting of freedom. Her own voice, when she used it, was thin but clear, no longer the whisper of a ghost. "They cast me out," she said, her eyes fixed on the pail of milk, its surface gleaming in the dim light. "They said I was empty, a field that would not grow, a vessel for nothing." She paused, the confession costing her dearly. She finally lifted her eyes to his. "I had a child. A daughter." The words were stones she had carried alone for 2 years. "She was born sleeping. I never held her when she was warm. I never—" Her voice broke, the final words lost to a grief too profound to articulate. She never got to feed her. She never got to give life. She did not need to finish. In the depths of Silas's guarded eyes, she saw a flicker of understanding so intense it was painful to behold. A deep, ancient sorrow of his own surfaced, a ghost of a shared language of loss. He knew this particular emptiness. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, not of pity, but of profound, unadorned empathy. It was an acknowledgement that bridged the chasm between them more effectively than 1,000 words ever could. Later that night, as they sat by the hearth, the world outside held at bay by the sturdy cabin walls, he did something new. He placed a second wooden cup on the table, next to her bowl. It was not a gesture of charity, but of inclusion. A place was being set for her. "Bess," he said, his voice still rough but softer now. He nodded toward the barn. "Her name is Bess." Alara looked from the cup to his face, seeing the man behind the wall of silence for the first time. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. "Alara," she replied. "My name is Alara." The fire crackled, casting a warm, gentle light on the 2 figures at the table. Outside, the plains remained vast and unforgiving, and the wind still mourned against the eaves. But inside the small cabin, something new had taken root in the silence. It was not love, not yet. It was something quieter, and perhaps stronger. A partnership forged in hardship, a shared resilience. The farm was no longer just his prison of grief, nor her temporary port in a storm. It was becoming, slowly and carefully, a home.